Michelle.
Daniel, OG Rose, and today we're going to talk about the release of the Map Is Indestructible.
Yes.
Woo!
It's releasing today.
Yes, it is on July 11th, 2025, which is also the 200-year anniversary of the Jefferson Literary and Debating Society at UVA, which I was part of and loved and met a lot of incredible people. And this is volume 2 of the True Isn't the Rational trilogy. It will also contain the paper, The True Isn't the Rational, as well as the paper, The Map Is Indestructible. And it's subtitled Problems of Internally Consistent Systems. And the first book in The True Isn't the Rational was called The Conflict of Mind, Major Epistemological Problems. And one of the key, I'll just talk about one of them, kind of the key problems that book discusses, is the idea of the inevitability in today's complex world of encountering a conflict of mind situation, which, to put very generally, kind of inspired by Clifford, is the idea of when epistemic responsibility comes in conflict with epistemic possibility, and how this creates a feeling of conflict in the mind. So, for example, it can feel epistemically irresponsible to, say, have a position about a political party, or let's just say the recent tax bill. You look at that tax bill, and should you support it or should you not? Well, it's hundreds of pages. It's incredibly intricate. And how do you even get access to it? When it's released in just a few days before it's going to be, voted on. And it's really just kind of impossible, really. It's epistemically impossible to really get a grasp on it. Oh, and at the same time this is occurring, there's events happening in the Middle East, there's events online, and there's this feeling of it being basically intellectually impossible by which to handle all of these situations. And yet it simultaneously feels kind of intellectually, because by epistemological we mean kind of epistemic, like intellectual. It also feels intellectually irresponsible or almost immoral not to look into all these things. And it also can feel kind of irresponsible to have a position on them if you're not well studied in them. So should you just disengage? Should you not care about them at all? Maybe you should just not worry about them? But is that intellectually responsible? And then you have to wonder about that. And you have these conflicts of mind where your mind is very conflicted. And when you're faced with that kind of existential tension, you can be overwhelmed, you can break down, and there can be kind of tensions that you suffer because of conflict of mind situations. Well, that book ended with a paper called Deconstructing Common Life, which really was looking into David Hume, especially through the work of Donald Livingston, his incredible book on Hume, and the idea that one of the ways we can deal with conflicts of mind is to really focus on the common life, as Hume put it, or the concrete, or something that is that we have lived experience on, and kind of base our intellectual life on that everydayness. Now, more has to be said on this, but it can kind of bind you from conflict of mind situations. But of course, that also runs the risk of isolationism, and runs the risk of not really facing global pluralism. And we've talked before about how counter-enlightenment thinking, before we start talking the modern counter-enlightenment, can lead to political isolation and even fascism. So it's a major problem. So this is a major epistemic problem. How do we handle conflicts of mind? And there's more in the book than that, but how do we cope and address the tension between epistemic possibility and epistemic responsibility in our world today? Well, one of the ways we do it is by creating maps. And maps in this book, The Map Is Indestructible, we can think about them as ideologies, and the key term we're going to be using is an internally consistent system. And an internally consistent system is basically, we can look at it this way. Joel Carini, at the Natural Theologian, he's been talking about presupposition in theology, where the presuppositionalist is just, they accept their axioms of a Christian worldview, and they're just going to basically confirm its internal consistency. They're going to see that there are no essential contradictions. Now, people may have different axioms, but you're going to show that there's nothing internally broken or wrong or essentially wrong in a Christian worldview if you just accept the presuppositions. Well, that's going to give you an internally consistent system. And when you have that, then basically it helps you deal with conflicts of mind, because if it's outside of those presuppositions, you don't have to think about it. And also you can sort of get a sense of your responsibility to learn something like the American tax system or these giant tax bills, right? You can say, well, unto Caesar what is Caesar's, maybe, and have a theology that says the Christian doesn't need to worry about that, right? It can give you ways to manage conflicts of mind and anxiety. Now, there are, of course, going to be other anxieties, but there's a consistent system that can help you deal with the complexity in the world today. But what do you do when you encounter people that have other presuppositions or that don't share your presuppositions? Well, now we can have new tensions that arise, and then that can reopen you to conflicts of mind or various anxieties. Much more needs to be said, but that's kind of pointing at some of the connections or bridges between the conflict of mind and the Map Is Indestructible, which again is volume 1 of The Truism of the Rational and volume 2 of The Truism of the Rational.
Yeah, I guess it makes me think about thinking about the fact that people make maps. And I guess I'm thinking about why is it important that it almost feels like it's an emphasis to say that the map is indestructible. Like a physical map is just, you can destroy it.
Of course.
Right? But the interesting thing is, destroying the map doesn't destroy the territory.
Correct.
Right? Now, the risk is that these maps people make are maps, right? Like they aren't the territory. Now, the how most people live they have to kind of live as if it is the territory, right? Mm-hmm. I guess. But yeah, what is that, like simply an emphasis, or is there something to this idea of like the map is indestructible? Is that because we can't believe it to be destructible because we can't really rely on it as a map? Yeah. So
yeah. No, it's a great question. If we destroy the map, then we're exposed to the territory, which entails the Lacanian real. We're overwhelmed and we're destroyed. Also, the map is part of the territory. The map and the territory are actually inseparable because the territory entails map making. So you can never get a territory that does not entail creating a map. So maps will always be with us. Not only in the sense of, it's in both senses. There is the sense in which without a map we're overwhelmed and nothing makes sense. Right. So it can't be destroyed without also destroying us.
Right.
I mean, you could say the map is destructible in so much as we can be destroyed at the same time, but
right.
But then we're not around to experience its destruction. But it's also in the sense that it's a fallacy to think of a world where maps and territories are cleanly split. The territory entails map making. It entails subjects who make maps. And the book will talk a lot about the father of that phrase, or so it's attributed to, Alfred Korbowski, who is a very incredible thinker. And he wrote a book called The Science of Sanity. And he was really concerned with, one, the failure of people to realize that, well, maps were not territory, that words were not the things they represented, that signifiers were not the signified. And the reason why, he was so concerned about that is because if you didn't really think about the signifiers as independent realities from the signified, then you would ultimately just absorb some network of signifiers and basically think of the world through those signifiers and never question it. And of course, if those signifiers are wrong, it could lead to massive, massive consequences, negative consequences. Mm-hmm. And to give a more concrete example, you could say Korbowski is really concerned about identification, the idea that thought identifies things clearly, like a correspondence theory of truth. He's very concerned with, like, the equal sign, we could say, because he believes that basically there is no such thing as clear correspondence or identification. There's only situation, there's only approximation, there is only approach. This is very important because if you think identification is possible, then that's what you're going to try to do and think it's epistemically responsible to do it, and you'll go mad. And he's basically suggesting a world that believes in the possibility of identification is going to have mental illness problems, that it's going to have bad logic, that it will have bad politics, and the world will ultimately split apart because people will identify with one ideology versus another ideology. There will be hard divisions, and then there will be war and conflict. So Korbowski wants us to understand that we have to use maps, But maps are not the territory, so maybe there's grounds by which we could connect, because no one can be perfect. But then at the same time, to suggest that the territory generates maps, and so we have to take seriously the human map-making function and to always keep that moving. It can never stabilize into a stable identification, because once it does that, you have a stable state, and that leads to all sorts of pathos and various troubles. So to your question, the map is indestructible because the territory generates maps, because without it we suffer Lacan's the real. We can't make sense of reality. And also critically, a map, and this would be a key claim of the book, maps are not mere notions, meaning maps entail no internal contradiction. So if you are in a map, you will never find a reason to give it up.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a key idea, is that I think the dream, if I were to say very generally, the dream of the Enlightenment is the idea that basically there's a single indestructible map, meaning the map that most corresponds with the territory. And that the only indestructible map would be the one that's true. But actually, and this is where we get into Gödel and incompleteness, basically there can be hundreds of maps. No one knows the exact number of maps, but every map that is in fact a map never has to be deconstructed. It never has to be shown within its own consistency to not be true. And if that is the case, that means it is indestructible. Now, you may nevertheless choose to leave it, and this is a key point. Just because a map is indestructible doesn't mean you can't leave it. It just means that you can't leave it by finding it false or deconstructing it. It may lose its stickiness. You may have a trauma in your life that makes you give up the ideology. You may be, there's a lot of people questioning liberalism today or the World War II consensus. And it's not that, something has happened to show the World War II consensus is essentially incoherent. It's that people just simply don't buy it anymore. It doesn't have the same stickiness. It doesn't have the same emotional resonance. But that's very different from saying the consensus has been deconstructed by its own internal logic. So, and if you take all this very seriously, then you will use reason differently. You will not be using reason and rationality to say deconstruct maps or to look for essential contradictions. You're going to be using it to do something else. And that's a key argument of the book, is that if you realize that maps are indestructible, you're going to use thinking differently.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. It also makes me think about how it kind of made me think of how
Yeah, is that what it made you think about?
the anguish of being sleepy.
Yeah. You could just sleep, Paul.
Yeah, you're right.
It's like, no, the map is indestructible, and so am I.
And so am I, gosh darn it. Well, I guess, sorry, not to harp on the point, but
please.
I guess there was this thought of like, it almost seems redundant to say that the map is indestructible, but there, it's almost like saying the map is the map in that case, right? But there's something about, like, what I'm trying to get at is that that's actually, it's an important thing to have, like, there's something about a bit of a redundancy that is in the nature of a map, like, which is kind of like the experience of a map is its redundancy, which is why it works, which is why it's indestructible. It was how for some reason when I was thinking the map is indestructible, that there's something about that's like there's a necessary kind of redundancy in that. Obviously, the map is the map wouldn't really communicate much qualitatively about it, right? With the indestructible, it is a qualitative kind of understanding of that.
Well, I think most people think of a map as a thing that gets in the way of the territory, and because it's not the territory, it can be destroyed. The territory can't be destroyed, but the map could be. Most people view the map as just a map.
Right.
But the claim here is that, no, the map is indestructible. So it is not arbitrary. Like, maps are internally consistent, and they're actually an indivisible component of the human experience.
Yeah.
If you got rid of it, we would be destroyed, and the territory would just generate a new map.
Right. But to the redundancy point, again, that's kind of why it works. Like, there's something about this idea of it's kind of just speaking to the fact that internally consistent systems themselves are also types of sort of redundancies. But that's what we sort of come to rely on as humans, even though we might kind of bemoan the fact that there's redundancy. Or maybe a redundancy is not the right word. It's like repetition or something. Like, for example, it's very true what you say about the map is indestructible. Because if you think about even just when you drive somewhere, okay, you usually use the same route, like more or less, right? And so even if you could say, well, no, Daniel, like I could take this map and I could burn it, right? In your mind, you have a map, like you have a path in your mind, literally like the neurons, like you have a literal map in your head of the map of your path that you do and you do and you do, this kind of redundancy, this repetition, that then causes it to solidify into this indestructible map.
Yeah.
And it's not the territory because you know those times when you're driving and suddenly you kind of just slow down for whatever reason, or you look left when you usually don't, or something, or look right when you usually don't, and so you think, oh, that's funny, I've never seen that road before. You've passed it a million times, never really noticed it, but then you did. So it's obviously not the territory because there's so much more to it, right? But it doesn't change the fact that there's this indestructible nature to the map or path, this kind of construction of redundancy and repetition that is indestructible.
Well, the tendency, the opening section, is map naturing, and part of the idea is that the tendency to create maps is indestructible because you will form patterns, and and the issue is, I think basically people tell themselves, oh, I could take a different route, I could do things differently, and that actually becomes a certain rationalization that makes them never see the pattern tendency of human beings, and the tendency to thoughtlessness as well, as Eba would stress.
Right, and that idea of like, well, I could take a different route, but you just so happen to never take.
Yeah, you just so happen to never.
And I think, well, and it can definitely make you think. It's kind of like when you think in your head, oh, that would be easy to do, and then but that very reason is the reason you never end up doing, like, getting around to doing that thing, because if you really did it, you'd realize it was kind of hard or different or uncomfortable, or you wouldn't feel as like familiar. Now, the beauty of it is you open up your eyes and you say, wow, this is so cool. It's like a scenic route, right? The scenic route. And you can really kind of actually maybe experience change or seeing something differently. But it does prove that, like, the fact that we can have the thought of, I could take a different route, only preserves us further potentially preserves us further in the route we take.
Well, I mean, to that point, absolutely. I think basically one of the reasons for the stress that the map is indestructible is because I think most people think if a map is false, then it will destroy itself with time. And by saying it's indestructible, it's saying, no, you can't assume that. You can't assume that a map that is not actual or does not have a relation with the absolute will necessarily deconstruct itself. In fact, maps never will. Maps never deconstruct themselves. So if your standard is to say, well, it's always maintained its consistency and it's never failed, therefore it must be the best, or therefore it must be the map that is most like the territory, this does not necessarily follow. Because maps in their internal consistency, which also entails a Gödel point, which means a point where correspondence and coherence show to not be the same thing, that would seem to destroy maps. But this is a kind of key move of the book, is to actually say that Gödel's incompleteness, that means anytime we encounter something that should show our map is false, we can just attribute it to axiomatic incompleteness, and therefore just keep going about our business. Like, it is not that, like, there's this weird idea where Gödel's incompleteness, which for me shows that coherence and correspondence are different, that if you have a mathematical set that is completely coherent, that very coherence will make it impossible to show that it's axiomatic and necessarily corresponds with reality. But if you can show that it corresponds with reality, it won't be able to create its own consistency, because the correspondence will require so much to calculate, that the consistency will be beyond what would ever be able to be shown in a set. Now, that all has to be expanded on, but we can put it this way. If you're able to show a map is like the territory, the map is incomprehensible, because it would be so large and so complicated you couldn't comprehend it, right? So a map that corresponds is useless. This is another way to put it. Like, a map is useful. It's like the Borges story. Yeah, it's exactly like the exactitude of science, right? But a map is useful because it is wrong. And And yet that wrongness is necessary for making the territory comprehensible.
Well, that's so what you're saying is the Gödel point is going to be like, that's just the map. That is, instead of it looking like a contradiction, because like you said, maps won't contradict themselves or deconstruct themselves.
No. The Gödel point just shows it's a map, and you'll say, well, of course, it is a map. That's what it is. That doesn't contradict it.
Right.
And so this point of the Gödel point that would seemingly, and I think this is the tricky move, the point that would seem to unveil that the map, you would say, oh, well, it's just a map, therefore it's false. No, it's just a map because it is what it is, of course. So you just say, all internally consistent systems entail a point that make you realize it's not the territory. Okay, but that doesn't mean it's false because all maps are not the territory. And so basically, therefore, what ends up happening is when you go about your life and you encounter, say, something that, let's just say, something that Christianity cannot account for, like bioethics or the problem of evil or something, you could simply say, well, God's all-knowing, God's all-powerful, and he has that in control. Well, yeah, that would follow from Christianity. That would be a fair address. You would never necessarily have to give up Christianity because of the problem of evil. Because you can simply attribute it to God's mystery if you want it, right? Likewise, if you believed in Austrian economics and you believed like hard libertarianism, that what we need is a free market, you can always basically say anytime there's a failure in the market, you can say, well, because it's government intervention, and we've never seen a world where there wasn't government involved in the market. Therefore, you can't say for sure that a pure libertarian Rothbardian economy wouldn't work. Right? Because you could simply say that it has never been attempted, right? Or you could, if you believe in radical freedom and anarchism, if people use that freedom to destroy one another, you can say, well, that doesn't show that anarchism can't work. It just shows in this instant it didn't work, right? You can always come up with a plausible, here's the key, plausible explanation for something that should show that, hey, your map was just a map and it's not the territory. You can simply say, well, no, it's because people did it wrong, or this hasn't been done. So yeah, it shows that it's a map, but of course it's just a map. But that doesn't mean it's wrong, because all we ever have is maps. And so you can go on forever. So what this means is you can't assume that simply because you have an environment where maps are running up against one another, or you have someone in a map who follows it for long enough of a period of time, that will ever necessarily lead to a greater apprehension of the territory, if you will, or a greater apprehension of the absolute, to use the Hegelian term. You can never assume that simply the running of the process of internal consistency will ever necessarily lead to more of a grasping of the absolute. It may not. It could just crystallize in itself forever and ever and ever and never go anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that wonders, in a sense, what I'm hearing and what it makes me think about is how a map within itself will not be able to show you, like, in a sense, it's everything to the person who uses that map to get to where they need to go. Really, they don't need anything more than that, truthfully.
Correct.
Right? In terms of getting where they need to go. But in terms of knowing where they are, or what's going on around them, whether they need to know that or not is another question. But in terms of understanding the territory more maps might be more beneficial, in a sense of like, oh, I didn't know there was that landmark. I didn't know there was that landmark. Oh, mine says this landmark. Oh, interesting. That would be in here. And you kind of fill in these sort of gaps. So in a way, it makes me think of like, that seems like a pro for pluralism.
If you can handle it.
If you can handle it.
But your map says the other people are wrong. And your map is indestructible and will always say the other people is wrong. Yes, if you can learn to relate to other maps. And yet, here's the key. Can you relate to other maps even if your map suggests that the other maps are useless?
Right. Well, like without them losing their legitimacy. Without your map losing legitimacy to yourself.
That's correct. Like that. And part of the move that may open up people to relating across maps is if they realize that their map must necessarily create the effect in its consistency that other maps don't have a role. if you realize that's just a structural fact of a map, then the fact that your map creates that impression will not necessarily mean that that is the case of reality. It may just be a structural reality of maps. And that then means you as the subject can choose to not take that structural fact as authoritative and relate to other maps as a possible good in of itself for some reason, because of things that might emerge or surprise you that cannot be predicted ahead of time. And what might those things be, right? Well, we talk about beauty all the time. We talk about geopedia all the time.
Yeah.
A failure to realize, I mean, ultimately this is all pointing to the idea, a failure to realize that maps are indestructible reduces the probability of the geopedic and increases the chances of the algorithmic winning. Because you're not going to think it, because if you don't realize maps are indestructible, then you would easily take the working of your map as evidence that you should keep letting it work and you shouldn't change anything. Why would you change anything if it never breaks, right? Well, the fact that it never breaks might mean you're in a Kafka story, or you're in a Pynchon novel, because we'll talk about Pynchon risks, or you're in a conspiracy, or you're in sort of something where you've been, your horizon has been closed to make you incapable of seeing outside of it. So you would not assume that functioning would mean that there's nothing you need to think about. Like, that's also, I think, a kind of a critical idea. If you realize the map is indestructible, then you will not assume by the fact that nothing has ever broke your map means that there's nothing you need to think. Because I think that's what people do. The map's working great, so we don't need to think about anything, right?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think, it's yeah, definitely. I think that, like I said, is the point of yay for that can be yay for pluralism, but like you said, if you can handle it, right?
Yeah.
If you can realize, oh wait, but it's very plausible. It's a very plausible thing to think. If you ask two people to draw a map of, I don't know, some area, even the same area, the two people are probably going to draw it differently. Like there's going to be some similarities, but there's going to be some differences. And I think that, again, if you can handle like saying, oh wow, let's kind of like learn from each other's maps, there'd be a lot of potential beauty there, like you're saying, the geopedic. But if you can't, then you, like you said, you may never feel the need to consider that there are maps, let alone learn from them, let alone allow your map to become more I don't know. It kind of makes me think of like it might be too simple as elaborating on your map or like filling out your map more, but I do think there's an aspect of that which can be can be good, which can be helpful, and like some of the great, just really quick, some of the great stories that people love, whether as children or when they get older, Lord of the Rings, for example. It's a lot of times some of the most epic things about those books, and I remember as a child that feeling the same way, is like they always had that map page, and the story would often unfold that like people were telling their tales and their histories to kind of figure out what else had to go on the map, where else did they have to watch out for, or go here, or find whatever it was. So it was always this kind of conversation about those things, and filling it out was a good thing. Like fleshing that out is a good thing.
Yeah. The question becomes, what is the goal of fleshing it out? Are you fleshing it out to prove that it's internally consistent and that there are no essential contradictions, or are you fleshing it out to find the Gödel point by which you will then reside in that Gödel point, relate with other maps? All maps entail a Gödel point, and that becomes the possible basis of a universal singularity, or a universal imperative by which singularities and through which singularities may relate. Now, this is really looking ahead, and but there is something to be said that you have to fill out your map. But the question is, are you filling it out to make it invincible, or are you filling it out to precisely find the point that will unveil its incompleteness? which of course then you have the choice at that incompleteness to decide what it means.
Right.
Does that mean, oh, it has axioms? Well, all maps do, therefore I finally have an indestructible map. Because the point of its greatest weakness is simply a revelation of its reliance on the non-rational. Or, so you could use, you can use the experience of the Gödel point in favor of the indestructibility of the map, and so your ideology. Or you can use it as a dwelling place of faithful presence, by which then to relate to other people. So yeah, I mean, there's filling out the map to find the Gödel point. And when you encounter the Gödel point, which every map must necessarily entail, then you have the choice. You have a choice, an absolute choice, at that moment on what that means. You can say, I found the Gödel point, which is simply the point in my map that unveils its need to rely on axioms or non-rational axioms, and therefore I'm done. I've made an indestructible map. I never have to change anything. Perfect. Or you find the Gödel point precisely to make that the place in which you dwell and focus on as a possible opening to other people, as people opening to other maps, open to other individuals, of whom you'd be able to relate to if they, in their own Gödel point, resided there. So, for example, if you see, atheism has a Gödel point, Christianity has a Gödel point, Islam has a Gödel point, conservatism has a Gödel point. Every map has a Gödel point. That's the claim. And therefore, every single map can find their Gödel point. Basically, they could use that to simply say, yeah, these are our presuppositions. These are our non-rational basis for these thoughts, and we're going to stick to them. Great. Or you could emphasize those points and focus those points. And anyone who did the same within their own map, that becomes the basis of a pluralism that actually could function. But you would have to have people that could handle the anxiety of doing that.
Well, yeah, that's good. It makes me think, though, about... First, the part of me wanted to say, it kind of sounds like making an absolute choice that your map is destructible.
Mm-hmm.
But then it made me think, well, maybe it's not so much that, because it's not just erring on the side of, like you said, the map cannot be deconstructed in a sense, right?
Correct.
So it's more like choosing to accept that the map is indestructible,
yes,
but that the map has a Gödel point in which you can be like, to play on the word indestructibility, or so, I don't know.
It's like iron in parentheses.
Yeah, kind of. Yep. A little bit. Like it's more about you in that position and that subjectivity versus like the map itself.
It's a point where you can realize indestructibility does not necessarily mean true or absolute, and in that, in a sense, destroys it. But you don't destroy it in the sense of deconstruct it. You relate to it differently, and so you hold it differently.
Mm-hmm. But that's the thing. You may have to be in a type of destructibility. Like, that's not a word. But there's being indestructible, having the ability to allow your own subjectivity to be deconstructed, to not deconstructed, but I'm thinking about the opposite of indestructible, and I can't think of the word.
Destroyable.
Yeah, right.
Fallible, vulnerable.
Yeah. Basically, I mean, it's all of those things that require vulnerability, and saying, no, like, this map is not, it's not able to be destroyed. It is indestructible, but I can allow myself to be a subjectivity that can hold the possibility for that type of destruction, which is a type of vulnerability. It's not just like becoming a kind of, I mean, I do think that humans deal with their own element of brokenness. That's a reality. But it's not to stay in that place, though. It's to kind of recognize that as the opening for
again,
the connection.
I mean, look, so basically, in a world without givens, as we talk about in Belonging again, and the issue of a given, like, human beings require something indestructible per se.
Yeah.
Or their world falls apart. If you don't have a solid framework or if nothing is solid, then humans are overwhelmed by anxiety. You have to have something solid. Like, you have to assume presuppositions, you have to assume a framework, or you can't comprehend anything, right? So something has to be indestructible. And the book will talk about how basically maps are trying to fill in the void left by givens.
Absolutely.
When there were givens, there were also maps, but now that there are not givens, maps are still trying to do the work, and they can do that by simply internal consistency. And they can say, well, you can never show that Christianity is necessarily false. You can never show atheism is false. Therefore, it is you can live your life according to it. Now, I would argue that having to do the intellectual work of showing your worldview is consistent is still more existentially demanding than just the thoughtlessness of givens.
Yes.
But it's what people are sufficing for. It's what they're accepting, given the internet and global pluralism. As long as I can find a system of presuppositions, we get presuppositionalism, and people are accepting that. But of course, then the problem with that is it absolutely leads to fascism or closed-mindedness, because people say that, well, these are my beliefs and I'm sticking to them, and then basically then it's violence, because people get different beliefs and they eventually butt heads, and then we get trouble, right? So this is a major problem. But maps fill in where there's a loss of givens. And of course, they reflect previous givens. But now, you could say, let's say for many people, after the loss of givens for Christianity holds itself together more intellectually, or more by finding ideas that can connect to show that it could be true, right? Where in the past, Christianity was more of, gathering at church, and you had a kind of schedule, and you just saw the world through Christianity. It wasn't so much of an intellectual act, right? And when you lose that givenness, because there's the increased optionality of how people live and choice, well, then you can try to recreate that effect through internal consistency. And I would argue that that most of the religions that also maintain givens can also, through apologetics and theology, be found to show that they have no essential contradictions if you accept their presuppositions. So that's what everyone is doing. But unfortunately, that's a much less existentially stable environment, and it only works to the degree that you don't interact with others, right? But once you butt up against different axioms and presuppositions, then people tend to explode, and there tends to be conflict, so you tend to get isolationism. But, so you need something, so here's the point. You need something indestructible. Givens had done it in the sense of they weren't thought about, they were just given. Maps are trying to do it, which is looking like the world splintering off into a bunch of small fascist states. The thing that needs to be indestructible is the subject, the person. The person standing in the... Because what you do when you stand in the Gödel Point is, instead of have your map do your indestructibleness for you, you stand in the Gödel Point and survive. And here's the key. There's a difference between an indestructibility that is never suffering subjective destitution and the indestructibility per se that goes through subjective destitution, which is not the indestructibility of you can't be destroyed, is that you've come through it and you've not been destroyed. So it's the indestructibility of the subject per se on the other side of subjective destitution, which is not a technical indestructibility, but a practical one, in that you've been able to handle the difference. You've been able to handle the encounter of anxiety, and then so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it, to bring in the concept of subjective destitution, because, like you're saying, then it's a kind of, it's a going through the fire basically to come out as the sort of the refined whatever you want to say, metal, diamond, whatever it is.
Yeah. And I should note, like, Reconstructing ASA, which is the third book in the Truism of the Rational, will talk more about the faithful presence and the idea if we take seriously that the thing that needs to be quote-unquote indestructible is the subject. Well, how would you reconstruct Aristotle's ASA, the ASA, the law of identity? How would you reconstruct logic? How would you rethink thinking? Now, of course, Reconstructing ASA, the main paper that kept me up for 15 years, ASA, I end up finding it all in Hegel, so there's going to be a lot of overlap with the science of logic. But that kind of idea that if the subject becomes the basis of logic, as opposed to a map, then that changes things. That changes how we think about thinking.
Yeah, and I think this is also helpful and important in thinking about how we think about deconstruction, actually.
Yes.
Because I think it's very easy, and I've definitely felt this too, where there's a way in which we live in a time with so much information where a lot can be essentially deconstructed, for lack of a better term, but there's very little equipping of what it means to do anything with all of that information, or if you should even do anything with that information or not, or how, or whatever. And so it's tempting to think about, even in using language like destructibility or indestructible, about sort of just you basically not having, like, thinking of maps as bad or something like that. But the whole point is that they're not. It's about how we get dialectical with our subjectivity and maps. And then we don't just do this sort of because I think the deconstruction route ultimately does, at least I will say, speak personally on a psychological level, is just a little bit dizzying, because you don't really, but it's necessary. Like, that's why the subjective destitution is necessary. But if you don't really know, I do believe there's a big thing about the cultivation of subjectivity, that I do believe it's going to require philosophy. It's going to require thought, like thinking through really difficult things that often you just don't want to think about, right? Like, you don't want to just like, those things are required for getting to the other side, where you still have a map. It's not like you don't have maps or anymore. But I don't know. To me, that's helpful, because it can be very easy to just kind of do the all or nothing kind of move with our brains.
So there's the idea. So you're going to have a map. That's inevitable. The key is not to use the indestructibility of your map to avoid you yourself undergoing subjective destitution. Like, you choose the Gödel point when you could just have the indestructibility of the map defend you from negativity, defend you from otherness, right? But what you do is choose, no, I'm going to reside in the Gödel point, and I'm going to still, to practically function, have to use the map, but I'm not going to use the indestructibility of the map to avoid difficulty. I'm going to stand in the Gödel point and myself go through subjective destitution and not be destroyed. And I will practically be indestructible, even though I'm technically not indestructible. I very much could be destroyed. Here's the issue. A map is technically indestructible. The subject has to be practically indestructible. And then in Hegel, in a way I like to say, in Hegel, the practical is more real than the technical. And that's kind of the great flip. But that's very, very difficult, because the other reason you need philosophy is, what is the kind of thinking that thinks the space between correspondence and coherence, not just in terms of correspondence or just in terms of coherence. This is a very fuzzy, this is a fluctuating thinking, this is an unstable thinking, this is a thinking, it's like in Heidegger, this idea that truth has this veiling, unveiling character to it. Like, the truth is the very motion of, as something is unveiled, it's veiled at the same time, okay? Well, you can think of the relationship between coherence and correspondence like that. Whenever correspondence is being realized, then it is covering coherence. Or whenever there's coherence, it's covering correspondence. These things are always sort of covering one another. A way to put that is when you say you do a scientific experiment and say, well, it is a fact that, water is H2O. That's just a fact, right? That doesn't seem to have any correspondence at all. There doesn't seem to be any system of variables adding together. It's just a raw fact. Well, actually, when you say water is H2O, you're now the kind of subjectivity that can experience H2O. You can think water. You can use language. There's actually an entire network of principles by which, when you say the fact is that water is H2O, well, a donkey would never say that or never think that, and that would be completely meaningless to them. Now, that doesn't mean it's false that water is H2O, But it's to say that the moment you talk about H2O, you're actually talking about an entire consistency of a worldview that is afforded by human subjectivity. So the correspondence of water equals H2O seems to conceal the entire network of human beingness, if you will, that makes it possible to think in terms of H2O. But it's there, right? But in the same way that the moment we start talking about the consistent, like you can talk about, let's take apologetics on Christianity. There's no essential contradictions. And really, when you study all the apologetics of the great religions and you study all of the explanations for every worldview, you see this problem of maps quite clearly, because there's always an answer. There's always an explanation. There, you can always see how it could be true. But the issue is that you could spend hundreds of hours learning the internal consistency of Christianity, and this would feel like an experience of correspondence with actuality. It would feel like discovering the truth. But actually, all you would be doing is showing the consistency of the presuppositions of Christianity, which may be true, but it would not necessarily be the truth. So that's that idea that experiences of coherence bring with them the feeling that you're also getting correspondence, as the feeling of correspondence gives you the feeling of coherence, right? But actually, you're always dealing with coherence / correspondence. It's always both. You need philosophy because you have to think that bothness, which is always trying to conceal the other and hide the other. And you have to remind yourself as you're forgetting, oh, wait, coherence isn't correspondence. Oh, wait, correspondence is not coherence. And that's exhausting. And also you have to have mental models to keep yourself from doing that when you don't. That's why there are so many papers like on monotheism or scripted or, the phenomenology of true ignorance. These are all the different ways that the mind keeps you out of the betweenness, in too much on one side or the other, or losing sight of maps. So you need, because this way of thinking that is always trying to maintain the flip, the unveiling between correspondence and coherence, this is not natural. Thinking, your energy-saving brain, the number one thing it's going to do is trying to convince you coherence equals correspondence and be done with it. And if that doesn't work, it's going to try to convince you that correspondence is all you need, just a hard empiricism, a hard scientism. You don't need metaphysics or ontology or anything, and be done with it, right? The brain is completely in the business. It doesn't care. It will happily accept you accepting one side or the other. Hard empiricism or a theological presuppositional system. Either way is perfectly fine. Just whatever you do, don't try to think the metaxis, to reference Desmond's work, the betweenness of correspondence and coherence. To dwell in the Gödel point is to dwell in the betweenness. Because the Gödel point is precisely the revelation that coherence is not correspondence, and that you're always trading off between those two things in the act of intelligibility. So to dwell in that is to have a commitment to never forgetting that reality, which is not natural. And philosophy, in my opinion, if it's actually doing what it's supposed to do, is trying to keep you in that motion. Keep you in that unveiling with the UN in parentheses. Keep you in that truth, as Heidegger talks about, which is this destabilizing principle. And if you do that, how might the problem of global pluralism change? How might we rethink those kind of issues?
Yeah, and I was just thinking about the fact that it's funny, though, because maps can be, so helpful and so correct, and it's I think it's also I don't remember what adjective you recently just used. Exhausting about it. Yeah, exhausting. I think that's fitting. I think too it can feel scary, right?
Yes.
Because if you stand at Gödel point, that often means that sometimes it looks like you're like betraying your own map.
Yes.
But yet you're not. It's just that you're willing
appearing
to stay.
heretical as the
yeah, appearing heretical, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, from Rosie Cross too.
Yeah.
And so that yeah, I think that's a really, because there's this sort of, for the one in the Gödel point dwelling there, if we can talk about it like we've been mentioning in this talk, there can always be that like thought at the back of your head of like, well, maybe I would have just been right all along to not be in the Gödel point, to just
maybe my map is actual.
And maybe it was like never something to kind of it's not that
your map will tell you shouldn't. You know.
Well, right, and sometimes you can feel like, I don't know, sometimes you can feel like you're doing things or in your life, or you like that you're kind of feeling the potential failure, which a lot of times has to do with subjective destitution, but it also could be like somebody could easily be like, you should have just stuck to the map a little bit more. You wouldn't have, you wouldn't have been making wasting all this time or making these mistakes or feeling this sense of potential failure. And so that's the tricky part too. However, the reality is that, again, those maps don't have the territory, and I do think that staying at the Gödel point does keep you a little bit more open to the fact that there is a territory that is actually, in some ways, I don't know if it's in a sense more accurate than the map is, but the map is very accurate to itself, and it's very accurate for what you need it for.
And it can perhaps be incredibly good. But can it be beautiful? And it can function. I mean, if it's internally consistent, is incredibly functional. But that actually can be the problem, is it can function so well that if it encounters something that it can't deal with, you would have no reason to think that it couldn't, and so you'll keep trying and trying, and the dysfunction, can always be interpreted in a manner that we need to keep trying, and then you eventually get catastrophe.
Yeah.
But I mean, what I would also say is that if you're in the Gödel point, there's a very real sense that keeps you actually connected with the territory, because the territory is the very generation of the trade-off between correspondence and coherence. And so you're staying in the point where you don't forget that, which is the best you can get at the territory. Like, you can't get the whole territory by definition, but you can get the principle. You can quote unquote get as the territory the very principle of the trade-off between coherence and correspondence, and that be the basis of the shared territory that everyone has. Because that's kind of the issue. The problem of global pluralism is everyone is fragmented into maps. So seemingly the only way you could deal with that, of having a shared intelligibility, would be the territory. But if the map's not the territory, aren't we doomed? Like, doesn't that mean there's no possibility of shared relatability? Well, if every map entails a Gödel point, and the Gödel point is precisely the unveiling with the UN in parentheses of the mechanism of the trade-off between coherence and correspondence, and that itself is part of the territory, is an actual characteristic of the territory, then that precisely can be the shared territory that everyone can have, that can become a basis of relatability. Across maps, that doesn't deconstruct maps.
Right.
That's the $1 million trick. You've had a lot of people that have tried to deal with global pluralism by deconstructing maps.
Yes, yes.
Well, the problem is then you get nihilism, and people can't make sense of their lives, and everyone is miserable, and capital ultimately swoops in and wins, right? If you destroy maps,
some other map just
springs in, right? So that's not going to work. And yet, there is something about maps that creates the problem. So what do? You talk about the Gödel point that every map entails in its very difference, and you have the universal characteristic of every map be that, and then each subject dwells in that map in the Gödel point, and that becomes the means of shared relatability.
Would it be fair to say that it's not simply it's like it is dwelling in the Gödel point, but it's a kind of a frequenting of the Gödel point, because you're still kind of using map,
sure.
like, okay.
Absolutely, it becomes your home base. You could put it that way. So you go off into the map, but you always come back to the Gödel point. You're always avoiding the temptation to avoid it.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I'm getting like an image in my head of maps, and then kind of like that little, I don't know why I'm thinking of as a pinhole in terms of like this sort of Gödel point, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of like if the map had been folded in four so much, and then that little tiny middle spot gets like a tiny little hole just from the frequency of the folding. But I think that of that dropping down to that hole into like the actual territory, and how that territory reminds me of the concept of the infinite, like it's eternity, right?
Absolutely.
And it's true. If you were to really like territory, it's crazy. It's like if if you think about how much you would need to the information that your brain has to process. That's why your brain does a lot of like grouping, right?
It has
Just
to.
groups.
A map is a grouping.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Like they say your brain actually knows how many steps you look at, or you step up, but you don't know that your brain is like taking that information in. But on the whole, it does do a lot of grouping so that you can handle it. You can like process the images and all of that. Which is pretty miraculous. But really, like there's in a couple of inches there's hundreds of blades of grass, right? And each of those has their own like unique little aspects to it. So it really is kind of infinite. And it,
absolutely. Yeah.
And so, anyway, I'm saying that because, why I'm bringing this up about the concept of relating the territory to the infinite or eternity, is because I was thinking, like, somebody might say, why be more in touch with the territory? You know, in a way, it's almost like, why, right? But in a sense, you kind of have to hold like you still have to have your map so that you can still have to have your map to navigate within the infinite, because otherwise you kind of it's not something you can quite handle. Like we're talking about this processing of the sheer amount of information your brain has to process. So, but I think that being open to it makes me think of the other term that comes up in O.G. Rose, and also with Jacques and Javier, where it's like these glimmers, right? Like the glimmers of eternity, right? So that Gödel point or hole, which makes me think of that, is where it allows the glimmers of the eternal, which are actually always at play. Like they're always there, and actually they're that's the beauty of it. I mean, the fact, like, beauty overwhelms. That's why you can't handle eternity all at once like that, right? But eventually in time you get these glimmers, and perhaps the sense of like the totality, or I don't know if totality is the right word, but there's sort of like the ability to connect further with it as time unfolds. But yeah, so those are some images that are coming to mind, because I do think there might be this question of like, why get in touch closer with the territory? And I think it's because, well, we already mentioned it, these aspects of beauty, geopedia, but somebody could say like, well, but the territory would just completely, like, why get in touch with that? Because it just would pretty much could also obliterate our minds.
Well, I mean, first, if it's true that maps are basically going to destroy global pluralism and lead to violence, well, that would be a reason. And then second, but that would be a negative reason. The positive reason would be a claim that there is something about the Gödel point and beauty that are connected. And that would be a claim I would make. And
I would say that's probably because there's a connection between eternity and beauty.
Yes, and also if you have this movement between coherence and correspondence, then there's a glimmer where you can catch the transition. Like the Gödel point is a place of glimmers and glimpses. Where you have this sort of transitional activity that is occurring that you, for a moment, oh, I see, they pass over into otherness, to use that Hegelian term. But you have to make the absolute choice, because reason would, like, autonomous rationality would never have you dwell in the Gödel point. That is, why would you ever do that? Why not just have the consistency of the map, and why take the risk of being overwhelmed by the territory? Why would you do that, right?
Exactly.
Well, and there would be nothing... There'd be no way to justify that choice other than basically a non-rational faith that doing it will open up possibilities that otherwise could not be opened up, right? Like a claim like Joachim will say about beauty is that there is something about beauty that opens up accounts of reality that you can't have any other way, right? Yeah. So there's an idea of the absolute choice, and absolute choice is a choice that has no justification beyond its raw self.
Right.
Like, and so it's absolute in the sense of its own absolute. Like, to choose to interpret the Gödel point not in a manner that makes you be able to hide, if you will, in the indestructibility of the map, but in fact to be precisely the place that you need to dwell in, and thus suffer subjective destitution. Why would you do that unless you simply had a non-rational assent to some possibility that is not possible otherwise, and yet isn't guaranteed nonetheless? Because if it was guaranteed, it would be rational. and therefore would fall within the consistency of a map. It should also be noted on this idea that if every, Gödel points as a possible harmonization of global pluralism, which is also, I would argue, beauty, the space of the possibility of beauty. What is the unifying principle is not, because everyone's Gödel point is going to be different relative to their map. The Gödel point of Christianity will be different than the Gödel point of atheism, et cetera, so forth. Right. The universal repeating pattern is the subjective destitution that the subject themselves experiences in that. Yeah. And that, in the kind of character that then forms, and the flexibility that can handle it, that becomes the shared horizon by which people in pluralism can relate according to. That ability to actually handle that motion of thought, that movement of thought, without falling into deconstruction, holding it together with their own subjectivity, that becomes a sort of basis of harmony. But of course that is very difficult, and why would you do it? Why would you do it? There's no rational reason to do it, because why not have your map defend you from negativity? Exactly. Because it's indestructible. It's no different than technology. It's the Ivan Illich problem. Why would you not make your life more comfortable? Why would you not use technology, right? It's the whole problem Ivan Illich gets at in terms of epistemology. It would be because you non-rationally assented to possibilities of life that were otherwise not possible. Like you simply had the faith that this helps address global pluralism, that this is the address of global pluralism, because only beauty can be. And, we talk about that in other ways. And you can say, and this is the night when Paul just will not go to bed. So we'll see how much more we can. Yeah. He's like, I wanted to be here. We're talking about the map is indestructible.
Yeah, it's hilarious. He's just like flipping through the book quite literally.
It's really, really funny. Like the truism, the rational wants to make, in cases within epistemology and rationality itself, for these spaces of the beautiful in the strike of beauty. Where in belonging again, there will be talking about social arrangements, economic necessity for spaces of drive and intrinsic motivation and beauty and different things like that, right? And it should also be noted, another issue here is that I would argue most people's motivation can be simply to find the consistency of their map. So it's actually an extrinsic motivation. Where in the Gödel point, you actually have the possibility of intrinsic motivation, because you see it as a good in of itself, right? Mm-hmm. So there's also that factor of it. But there's also, like, the truism of the rational is going to be in considering the very way rationality operates, showing how it ultimately opens a space that we have to think something else. It would be the geopetic. In the same way that if we look at economics, it eventually opens a space where it hasn't thought the issue of demand, or where does demand come from, or creativity. Or if we look... Excuse me. If we look at sociology, there's eventually this problem between givens and releases, just like the problem of correspondence and coherence, that opens up an instability that we have to think and be able as subjects to hold. And if we cannot, then there's going to be self-effacement. So, that's some ways that the project kind of overlap. And to really argue, I mean, I basically think there's a way in which epistemology is trying to fill in the loss of givens with maps. It's trying to create a new kind of social stability based on internally consistent systems, tribes, people that share the same beliefs. Like ideology is doing the work of givens. And for most of Hivens' history, givens and ideology were kind of merged, like two rivers that kind of cross and merge. But now, without givens, the role of ideology is more naked and kind of distinct. And Zizek is very good on this. The book talks about Zizek all the time, because his thinking on ideology is a massive influence on this book. Like maps are trying to do the work. And basically... maps is the best we can hope for. I mean, this is also very important. If we're not ready for the beautiful, if we can't create spaces of handling diversity, well then maps are the way to contain us. Maps kind of contain that negativity from being unleashed that will destroy us all, or easily could destroy us all. So again, we're not saying maps are bad things. In fact, they're basically the best we've got
if we're not ready for the beautiful, which is a dangerous thing, because if the beautiful inverts, it becomes a terror. But the book is also arguing with belonging again that maps are not sufficient. They eventually fall into small fascist states, and et cetera, so forth.
Yeah, for sure. Today we may be facing an issue where there's like two things happening at the same time, where there's this algorithmic unification of the map, like everybody's got the same map, all the world's been mapped, kind of thing, and yet we have more, almost, I want to say, Deleuzian fragmentation, right, than ever before. In many respects, and not because maybe the algorithm even on the social front does that too, does a kind of unification of things. But what I mean to say is there's all these kind of like, there's these nuances, differences, kind of people are, just some sheer fact of people questioning institutions or this or the other, making varied alternative types of decisions, religion and their interpretations. I mean, Protestantism, even that's a while ago now, but you know what I mean? Just the fact of like kind of splintering types of effects. So I'm just saying that I think that it's even more important to understand the concepts in the map is indestructible, because we have a very unique dynamic at play right now in our historic moment.
Well, I mean, basically, the effort of unification is the logic of capital, the algorithm, which, hey, you could say that's the best we can hope for if we can't handle difference.
Well, people are like, great, like, yeah, it's spot on. The map is indestructible. We all have this map. It's great. It works. It does.
Well, the question is, does it work? Of course. And the claim is, if capital eventually has a stagnation, if it leads to an AI where humans are replaced, because a loss of conviviality, then you could not. There was very good reason. It was not crazy, and it's not crazy to be like, well, the only way we can deal with pluralism is capital. Capital works. We don't have to learn how to get along in terms of kind of deep human difference. We can just have capital do our social relations for us. But that has failed. Like, if that doesn't work, or there's good reason to think that doesn't work, well, then we have to do another route. And the other route is, well, let's just have mass multiplicity where we don't relate, and then we'll have difference. But that's going to lead to world war, and also the breakdown of the supply chain, and a whole lot of other unintentional consequences. So that means you have to somehow be different and get along. Well, how do you do that? Because your map says you shouldn't. And your map, right? And so, well, then we have to structurally find an element of every possible map in which people could absolutely choose to dwell in, that could become the basis of a common territory that opens up relatability in terms of beauty, not just goodness, because if you do that, you end up with small fascist states. Right. And the Gödel Point could also cultivate the kind of character that could do that, because it's going to be on the other side of subjective destitution, because by definition, in the Gödel Point, you are choosing not to use the indestructibility of your map to defend yourself from negativity. You as the subject are taking on that negativity and being practically and working to be practically indestructible, even though you're not technically indestructible, which is costly indestructibility versus cheap indestructibility, to use that Bonhoeffer distinction. We could say this. We could say that basically is incredibly rational to use any means of cheap indestructibility you possibly can. We're saying that the non-rational thing that humans need to do is costly indestructibility, which requires you to face a subjective destitution that if we cannot do, global pluralism is in massive trouble. That would be the claim. And I think it's true.
Yeah.
But the book comes out today.
Woohoo!
And so pick up a copy, please.
Get your
maps. And Paul stayed awake, and we're going to try to put him to bed now. It's really funny. And so for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com. You can go to Amazon. All purchases are really appreciated. All reviews are really appreciated. Be very curious what you think about the book. We like to talk about the truism, the rest. We call them essay books, which is not just an essay collection, but it's the idea that there are essays that are kind of decentralized, but they're ultimately threaded together by codas that kind of bring them together. I was always struck, I think it was Whitehead who said, that he was distrustful of long chains of deduction. And I always really like that, but then of course if you don't have chains of deduction, how do you make how do you make larger arguments? The idea of kind of the essay book is that you have kind of each a contained point that nevertheless feeds on the other, but if one of the points is wrong, it doesn't tear down the entire system. So it's a kind of essay book. The Conflict of Mind is an essay book. The Map Is Indestructible is an essay book, as will be Reconstructing A as A. It's a bit different. The parts of Belonging, again, the explanation are. But you'll find in The Map Is Indestructible numerous essays on numerous topics that are all building into what we discussed tonight with Paul. We talk about theoretical awareness, monotheorism, scripted. I could go on. The game theory of why most conversations are bad, Desire's masterpiece, work on Benjamin Fontaine. I could go on. So please pick up the book. You, again, can find it on Amazon. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.